Hey, good morning, you guys. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And if you're joining us online, we want to welcome you. Hopefully, you can come in person sometime. You guys are here. We're doing this thing here. We're packed out. That's great. What time's our service? 8:30. Our 8:30 service, we got a little more space in it. Next week is the time change, Sunday. So, 8:30 is going to be like 9:30. So maybe some of you guys might want to come to the 8:30 service next week. And then some of you guys who have kids, maybe you guys want to come to the 11:30 service too, because there's a little bit more room on both of those services. We're gonna keep doing this as long as we can, and then we're gonna add in a fourth service when we need to. Looks like it's going to be on Monday nights. And we're really serious about that, Monday night. There's a reason behind that, but I'll talk about that another time. Everybody wants Saturday nights, but Saturday nights are so hard on volunteers and staff and church family life. So Monday nights is actually a new trend that's really working well. You can be gone for the weekends, and then you can come back and grab a service on Monday night. So anyway, it's going to be a little different format and everything. We've already kind of got it all laid out and planned, but we'll let you know when we got to pull the trigger on that. It's going to be good. Well, we're continuing on in our series in Philippians chapter 3 today. And before we get started, and this has something to do with what I'm going to talk about today, is when I was a little boy, my grandmother told me, for as long as I remember, my grandmother told me that I was 25% Cherokee Indian. So I owned it. I'd talk to my friends, I'd be like, I'm 25% Cherokee. And, I know you're not supposed to say Indians. That's not politically correct these days. But, cowboys and Native Americans just doesn't have a ring to it. So I'd play cowboys and Indians, and it was like I always had to be the Indian. I always had to be the Indian. Because they'd say, well, why are you always the Indian? I go, well, I'm part Cherokee. And they go, oh, okay. And they just kind of went with it too, Like when I was in the Boy Scouts, I could build a fire faster than everybody else. And they would go, why? How come you can build a fire so fast? I'm part Cherokee Indian. And then, I grew up, I owned it. Those are my people. And so I owned it, and I grew up that way. Even when we were first married, Michelle and I were first married, I'm like, yeah, I'm part Cherokee Indian, so our kids are going to be part Cherokee Indian, And it was so funny. It wasn't until probably about 15 years ago that Michelle, she ordered this Ancestry.com thing. And I did this Ancestry.com. And do you know how much Native American I have in me? 0%. Zero. I was crushed. I was so disappointed. I mean, everything I thought about myself was just wrong. I thought I was 25%. Now I have a hard time building a fire. I get lost in the woods all the time now. It's like, Anyway, just a side note. I find it strange that out of all of the different ethnic groups in the world, that there should ever be racism among a white American. I mean, we are just nothing but a melting pot of all these different ethnicities. And it's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. And we're a melting pot, for the most part, for most Americans. The reason I mention ethnicity is because God knew exactly what he was doing when he chose the Apostle Paul to be his instrument for expanding the gospel and for planting churches among the Jewish people and among the non-Jewish people, the Gentiles. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Because of his pedigree, because of his 100% Jewish heritage, combined with his Roman citizenship, which is very unusual, Paul had the credentials and the authority to be the prime candidate for God to use to expand the gospel, even though a lot of the Christians at that time were questioning God. Why would you have Saul do this, or why would you have Paul do this? He is persecuting Christians, but God knew exactly what he was doing. And so we're going to look at this passage in chapter 3 of Philippians, and Paul's going to lay out, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to kind of lay out his heritage. Historically, he's going to lay out his heritage, his ethnicity, where he came from. And this is important. This is what he says. And he starts off with this, a little weird spot to start. He goes, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I am a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees, who demanded the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so zealous that I harshly persecuted the church. And as for righteousness, as for following the law, I obeyed the law without fault. And so what he's doing here for his listeners in the Philippian church is he's establishing his authority. He's establishing his heritage. And he says, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. Now that may sound weird to you, and we don't really talk about that very much as non-Jewish people in our culture, but that was a big deal for the Jews and their heritage. I mean, you would never hear me stand up here and say, you guys need to listen to me because I was circumcised on the 8th day, and you'd probably be like, that sounds a little weird to me, I don't know about that, but a good, proper Jew would have been circumcised on the 8th day after their birth. And so what this is doing from the very beginning, Paul is establishing from the very beginning, my family raised me strict Jewish and strict in the Jewish laws in every way. So he's establishing his heritage. In fact, his Jewish name was Saul, not Paul. Now, a lot of people, this is kind of a myth. There have been a lot of people that have taught that God changed the apostle Paul's name from Saul to Paul. I don't want to confuse you, but if you're new to the Bible, when you look at the first part of Saul's life, he was Saul, and later on, he's referred to as Paul. But God did not change his name from Saul to Paul, nor did Saul change his name from Saul to Paul. His name was Saul Paul of Tarsus. He had two names. And when he was referring to the Jewish people would have understood and he would have related to them better when he was Saul. Probably, we don't know this for sure, but probably named after King Saul. And then when he related to the Roman people, a good Roman name would have been Paul. And so he was able to identify with the different people. It's like my name is Thomas Mitchell Todd. I have 3 first names and 3 last names. You can do either way. They say don't trust a person that has 2 first names, but I have 3 first names and 3 last names. So do with that what you want. I don't know why, it sounds like an attorney at law firm is what it sounds like, Thomas Mitchell Todd. And, but I go by Mitchell or Mitch. And so, but when I'm here, but when I travel and I speak in different countries, I go by Thomas because they don't understand. Mitch is just not a common name for them, but Thomas is. In fact, when I'm speaking in Latin America, it's Tomas. Hey, Tomas. And I'm like, so I answer to Tomas, Thomas, Mitch, or Mitchell. Don't call me Todd. Anyway. But so he was able to relate to different peoples based on what name he was using. So he's both Saul and he's both Paul. Not only was he a Jew, but he's a Hebrew Jew. That added even more credibility to his authority and to his ambassadorship or being a representative for the gospel. Now, let me explain this a little bit. There's a little bit, if you Google this out there, there's going to be different responses, but this is like I've tested this out with different theologians, and this is kind of where we're at. Professors would teach me this. A Hebrew Jew was someone who still knew the Hebrew language. When you're classified as a Hebrew, it's more about your language, the language use, than it is about ethnicity. So when he says, I'm a Hebrew Jew, it means that he still kept his knowledge of the Hebrew language, and that was really important. So even though he was born in Tarsus, which was a Roman city, he still kept all of his heritage by being circumcised on the 8th day, by being raised in a Jewish home, and even understanding the language of Hebrew. So, and so, for instance of there's a diaspora. Are you familiar with that word? There's diaspora of Jews. Let me tell you what diaspora means, and you'll be able to impress the people that you talk to at lunch today. So a diaspora of Jews would be like this, that there are more Jews right now living around the world than there are living in Israel. So that would be the diaspora. So there's a diaspora of Kenyans and Nigerians living in gateway cities across our country right now: San Francisco, Chicago, LA, New York, and Miami. And so there's this large diaspora of Jews. These are people that live here. They're American citizens, but they are from Kenya. That would be the diaspora of Kenyans. There's the diaspora of Jews. So Paul would have been a part of the diaspora of the Jews, where he was born, he was raised in Tarsus, but he still kept his language. And so like if you were a Jewish person from Jewish heritage and you're born here in the United States, you're still a Jew, but if you don't speak the Hebrew language, you wouldn't necessarily be a Hebrew Jew. Does that make sense? That's kind of explaining that a little bit. And so Paul grew up outside of Israel, but he still kept that Hebrew language. All this is still part of him laying out his heritage and what gave him the authority to speak on behalf of God. And this was big. And Paul was actually one of the most educated of all of the apostles. He was educated by the famous Jewish rabbi Gamaliel. Gamaliel is found only in the Bible a couple times, but other historical writers outside the Bible, like Josephus and in the Talmud, Gamaliel was listed as one of the greatest theologians and philosophers, and Paul sat under him. That was his rabbi. So the Apostle Paul, if you're still with me on this now, Apostle Paul was chosen for a very solid reason by God, because he could talk to the Jews with all this incredible heritage of his upbringing, his education, and his training, but he also could talk to the non-Gentiles, to the Romans, because he was born a Roman citizen. That's what made him perfect for the job. Now we're going to move into the meat of this and more of an application for us, but I wanted you to get the background of that. So then Paul goes in and he goes on to say this. He says, I once thought that all these things that I just laid out to you, all this heritage, all this ethnicity, all the laws that I followed, everything that I followed to the T, I once thought that these things were valuable, but now I consider them actually worthless because of what Jesus Christ has done. It's not about what he's saying. It's not about me following the law and doing all these things. It's about what Jesus has already done for us. And so he's saying all the laws I followed, the fact that I speak Hebrew, the fact that I was circumcised on the 8th day, the fact that I was a Pharisee, all of that's rubbish. It's rubbish and it's worthless compared to knowing Christ and what he has done for us. And in fact, he goes on to clarify that anymore. He goes, yes, in fact, not only that, not only my heritage, not only following the law is worthless in comparison to Christ, but everything in this life is worthless. He says, yes, everything else is worthless when you compare it with the infinite value of knowing Jesus Christ as my Lord. For his sake, I have discarded everything else, counting it all as garbage. Now, the translators did not do the best job in translating that word garbage. It actually is much stronger word than that. It's actually doo-doo, you know? See, it's actually, that's what it is, or poo-poo. I don't know how you say it in the polite way, but you can imagine. That's the word that it translated. And so he says, I'm counting it all as garbage, so that I can gain Christ and become one with him. I no longer count on my own righteousness through obeying the law. Rather, I become righteous through the faith that I have in Jesus Christ. That's what I talk about to you guys all the time. It's like that when God looks at you, even though you're not perfect, if you put your hope and trust in Jesus, when God looks at you, he's looking at you through the lens of Jesus, and he sees you as perfect. He sees you as worthless because he's looking at you through the lens, through the viewscape of Jesus in his life. And that's exactly what Paul's talking about here. He says, I no longer count on my own righteousness through obeying the law. Rather, I become righteous through my faith in Jesus Christ. For God's way of making us right with himself depends on faith. In other words, it's not about how good you are when you die that determines whether you have a future with God or not afterwards. It is dependent on our faith in Jesus, not on what you have done. In fact, this is a good way to remember this. Christianity is not about what you do. It is about what Jesus has already done. That's a big foundational piece for us. If you're new to this thing, it's not about what you do, about all these actions that you do to try to get to heaven. We do the things that we do because of what Christ has already done. We do the things that we do because we want to please our Father. We want to please God, but not as some sort of a ticket or a pass to get into heaven. We do what we do for Jesus because we are so honored by what he has done for us. Does that all make sense? Okay, so he goes on. He says, I want to know Christ and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him. Paul's saying this is how much of a priority it is getting to know Jesus and learning and growing in his faith. Because I want to suffer with Jesus. Nobody really ever says, I kind of want to suffer. But Paul's saying, I want to suffer with Jesus. I want to know what that was like. That's how close I want to be to Jesus. I want to know what he was going through. I want to suffer with Jesus. I want to share in his death so that one way or another, I will experience the resurrection from the dead. Isn't that a powerful pursuit that he has for Jesus? That's the pursuit that you and I need to have. And what Paul is saying here is that the pursuit of knowing Jesus is the singular, most important pursuit that you can have in your entire life. And we talked about this last week. Jason talked about this really well last week. If you didn't watch the message last week online, if you weren't here, you should watch it. It was fantastic. But he talks about how our life is a vapor and a mist. I mean, it's just here today and gone tomorrow. It's just so fast. And there is nothing in your life, not making money, not having kids, not getting married. There's nothing in this life. All those things are important. There's nothing in this life that's more important for your eternity than your eternal life with Jesus Christ. That is absolutely should be number one priority. Actually, when you make that a priority, all these other things seem to be healthier in our lives too. It's amazing. But that should be your life's goal and pursuit above anything else. When Jason did this illustration, he had this orange rope last week, and he stretched the rope out, and we stretched the rope there, and we went out that door, and we went all the way to the end of Venice that way with the rope, and we went all the way around the world, and we just kept going with that rope, kept going with that rope, kept going with that rope. That was symbolic of eternity. And then he put a little piece of tape about this big on the rope, and he said, and this is your life in comparison to eternity. What you do with this space, with your faith anyway, is what determines how you're going to spend the rest of eternity. Not how good you are, but where you put your faith and in your trust and your priorities in your life. And it was just fascinating to me that, we talked about how life is just short. It's a vapor, it's a mist, it's here today, gone tomorrow. And we had Sunday after that message, in that afternoon, we had one of our dear members of the church lost his life in an airplane crash. He was an aeronautic racer. He was actually just finished up his race that he was racing airplanes in, just finished up a race and crashed on the way back to the airport. It was just heart-wrenching. And so you may know him. Greg Mailer is his name. He serves breakfast for the men at the Saturday morning men's breakfast, and was involved in the Tuesday evening Bible studies with men, and been in rooted groups and leading groups. And his wife, Mary Ann, many of you know her. She leads the Bible studies for the ladies. And we're going to have a celebration of life for him. That's Greg there. On 2 weeks away, I think November 16th. So I'm sad because I won't get to see Greg for a while. But then tell you, this celebration of life is going to be different. It's going to be different. You're all invited to this. It's going to be a little different. And here's why. I've been to some funerals where there's not any hope. I've been to funerals where I'm just like going, boy, it seems like there's no hope there. And it's not going to be that way with this, because I'll tell you why. Greg understood the pursuit of Jesus and serving Jesus, and that Jesus was a number one priority in his life. It wasn't always that way for Greg. It wasn't always for him. It was later on in life that he realized the truth of eternity with Jesus Christ. And what I would say is, we don't have any guarantees. You and I, we have no guarantees that we will live beyond today. I certainly don't mean to say that to scare anybody. But the truth is, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, if you put your faith and hope in Jesus, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about death. And in fact, I like what Paul says. He says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And what Paul is meaning by that, it's not that he had a death wish, not at all. What he was meaning by that is saying, hey, look, when the time comes that God takes me, that's going to be better for me. Because I believe this with everything in my whole being, that I'm going to be with God in heaven. But it's actually better for the church. It's better for you. It's better for all of us if I stay. Because if I stay, I'm living for Christ. And as I live for Christ, more people are going to know and realize their purpose in living. And so Paul's saying, for me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. And it's interesting also where Paul was writing this letter. When he was writing this letter to the church, it's interesting where he was writing it, because he was writing it in a Philippian jail cell. And we don't know exactly what the conditions are, but we know in Acts chapter 16 that if he was writing this in that particular location at that time, he was in a cell, basement type prison cell in chains and shackles. And so the conditions, I can't imagine what the conditions are in a first century jail, but I would say it was deplorable. And so it would be very easy for Paul also to waller in his self-pity, along with wallowing in whatever else is found on a first century jail floor when you're shackled and you can't go anywhere else. It would have been very easy for him to just be thinking back and thinking focused on all of his past mistakes and past sins and regrets. Even with him persecuting the Christians as he did before he met Jesus, it would have been very easy for him to say, oh, this is what I deserve. They are persecuting me just as I persecuted the Christians before I knew Jesus. I'm such a wretched man. I can't believe I've made all these mistakes in my life. I'm not worth anything. I should just die here. It would have been very easy for him to think that way and waller in that. I might have been that way. And he could be living a life of regret from past sins and from past mistakes. But he could be completely focused on the rearview mirror and his life being larger than the front windshield. But this is what he writes. He says, no, dear brothers and sisters, I have not achieved it yet. He's talking about his perfection in knowing Jesus and becoming like Jesus and knowing Jesus. I don't say that I've achieved it yet, but I focus on this one thing. He says, I'm forgetting the past and I'm looking forward to what lies ahead. I don't mean to say that I've already achieved these things or that I've already reached perfection, but I press on to possess that perfection for which Jesus Christ first possessed me. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Jesus Christ, is calling us. I stood here on this stage almost exactly 4 years ago in October of 2020, and I delivered my first message to the church here. How many people were here? Were anybody here for that? Yeah, we had about 12 of you here. That's good. That's good. And truth be told, I was going through a really rough time. I was confused. I thought maybe in ministry, I thought my best days were behind me. And I was just walking in the desert, you guys. I just was. It was a confusing time. I knew there was a season of change, but I didn't know what was going to happen. I'd been praying and praying and praying for that. And then something amazing happened. I had this, we lived on a little hobby farm, about 3.5 acres, and I had an old truck. And my old F-150 had 250,000 miles on it. It was like 20-some years old. And it was basically a long bed truck, a stick shift on the floor. It was a bed and an engine. That was about it, you know. And I drove this truck around mainly for the farm stuff. And I was driving down the road one day, and I was just thinking about all the things, you know, all the things in my past. And I noticed while I was driving, the rearview mirror just started shaking. I was shaking a little bit more than usual, you know, and I was just like staring at this thing. And I'm like, what's going on? This thing's getting worse. And that was kind of normal. Like everything started falling off on the truck, you know, just as it gets older. And it was just like, and I just kept staring at this rearview mirror, and all of a sudden it just fell off on the floor. And I was like, huh. And I raised up, and I was like, whoa. It's amazing how this little mirror can block so much real estate in your front windshield. Here's kind of just like a little picture of it, just to show you, just to give you an image of that. It's like, I never thought about how that mirror blocks so much of the front windshield until it's gone. I was like, this is fantastic. I can see so much. And then I thought about that, and I thought, you know what? I think that's what I've been doing in my life. I think my rearview mirror has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I keep looking backwards rather than looking ahead. And I think it happened, honestly, I think it's happened as the older I get. Because life's like a train, man, and it's just out of control right now, isn't it? Well, some of you guys know what I'm talking about, you know. And when I was 14, I couldn't wait. It seemed like it took forever to get to be 16 so I could drive, you know. When I was 16, it seemed like it took forever so I could be 18 and be on my own, make my own decisions without my parents. That's just a myth, but that's what I was looking for. And I couldn't wait till I was 21 so I could drink a beer or whatever, you know. Then I couldn't wait. And it seemed like it took forever for me to get to be 25 so my insurance would drop on my car. And then after that, it just kind of went. It's just like a train. It's happening so fast. And it'd be real easy for us, and I've been there too, where I kind of spend more time looking backwards of what my life was like, the mistakes that I made, even the successes that I had too. You can get wrapped up by successes just the same as you can mistakes. And I was spending all this time looking backwards. When that mirror fell off, I pulled off on the side of the road because I was in this dark, hurting place, just wondering what was next. And I saw for the first time that I need to make sure that I'm looking forward and looking for what God has next for me. I stood on this stage 4 years ago and I shared that illustration about the truck. Now, honestly, I was sharing that with the church because I really knew that our best days as a church were ahead of us, not necessarily behind us. And I felt like in some ways the church was looking backwards in their life and we wanted to look forward. So I was sharing that to the church. But if I'm real honest with you, that was born out of my own pain in my own life when I shared that with you 4 years ago. And then I see what God is doing and I see how God is moving in people's lives. And I just want to say to you today, don't let your rear view mirror be bigger than your front windshield. Let's stand together and let's pray. Father, thank you for just the way that you have a plan. Like you knew that Saul was going to become the Apostle Paul, and you had a plan for that even when we didn't understand it. But we look back on it now and we see it, we go, that was a perfect plan. Help us see the perfect plans that you have for our lives, even when we're in confusion. Help us just to look forward, to strain, like Paul was talking about, to strain forward for what's ahead. Help us to not spend all of our time looking backwards. We only look backwards as a point of reference to see what kind of dangers we've come from or what's around us. But help us keep looking forward in our life, God, as we keep following you in Jesus' name. Amen.